sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for. When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth. In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. I am one of your hosts, the Senior Nash, and with me is our other esteemed host.
My name is Ethan Nash. Welcome back.
Well, today we are going to spend some time revisiting a topic that we have actually covered a couple different ways. We're going to be talking about those critical, difficult conversations that we sometimes have to have with employees. It is not my favorite part of being a manager. It's hard because it's hard. It's difficult, and the other person might feel bad, and it could hurt the relationship, and you might not do it right, or you might not do it well, and it's so fraught. And I don't think I've met a manager out there who would say it's like one of their favorite parts of their job. In fact, I think I would be concerned if somebody said to me, "Yeah, I just love correcting employees."
Again, we're coming back to this topic today of having these hard conversations. And, in my experience and maybe in yours as well, these are the things that our clients or my clients, my managers that I work with, these are the things they have questions about. These are the things they need help with because it's emotional. And anytime emotions are involved, things get a little messy. And so we're hoping by the end of this episode that you'll walk away with some general ideas and concepts for handling some of these difficult conversations, specifically with how to deal when you're getting difficult responses from people, when you have to have those hard conversations with them. So that's what I'm hoping to cover by the end of today. Am I on the same page with you there, Mike?
Yeah. It's kind of the back end of the conversation here. We've spent time in other podcasts talking about, for example, how to give feedback and all the different moving parts of doing that well, making sure you're talking about behavior and not character and not what's in their head and all those things. We've spent at least a podcast or more talking about corrective conversations. We introduced the Birch model, BIRCH. Ethan, you'll link to those podcasts in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll link to our episodes on giving feedback. We have a few of those, as well as receiving feedback, because as I have experienced, often when you give feedback to people, sometimes you start getting feedback as well. So I'll link to the feedback episodes and some other episodes we have on just accountability in general.
Yeah, that's great. And so we're not going to really revisit the nuts and bolts of preparing for those conversations and how to have those conversations. But I really would encourage our listeners to go back and catch those podcasts, because today we're going to talk about the assumption, let's say that you've done that conversation, you've done your part pretty well, you've prepared, you were as you were giving the feedback to the employee, you were careful to not get into character, and you were listening really well, and you're doing all the stuff that we talk about. And now we're going to talk about what happens next. What happens when the employee does something other than what we kind of hope they would do, right? What we hope they would do is some version of, hey, you know what, you're right, and thanks for that feedback, and I'm going to work on that, and let's create an action plan, or that's perfect world. That's what we would like. But of course, that's not always what we get. And so today we'll be talking about what do we do as managers when we get those trickier responses.
Well, let's do this.
You know what? To start with, I want to ask you, Ethan, what do you suppose an employee is experiencing on an emotional level when they're in the middle of this conversation with their boss? What are all the various emotions that are going on for that employee? Let's start there.
Yeah. So if they're having a conversation, say I'm having a conversation with my manager, and it's not a fun conversation. It's corrective. It's something of that nature, right? What might I be feeling? What have I felt in these conversations throughout my career? I'm gonna look inwards. I mean, the kind of broad umbrella term that comes up for me is fear, which of course there's a whole bunch of components and elements and flavors of fear, but fear that I'm not stacking up or that I'm failing, right? There could be embarrassment involved in this conversation, like, oh man, I did this thing, or I made this mistake, or I behave in this way. That hurts. I don't want to show up in the world that way, so I'm a bit embarrassed. I would say those are the ones that come to mind for me. And there's also, I think, just there's a status thing going on as well. I think by human nature, for better or worse, oftentimes worse, we're driven by status, and to have a conversation where I'm not stacking up in some way or form, it's a hit to kind of the status that I'm seeking in the world. So what about you?
No, those are great. We got fear, we have embarrassment. I think that status thing kind of can lead to shame, which is a really horrible feeling, right? That I'm not measuring up. I feel bad about that. I feel bad about who I am. There's some fear tucked in there as well. There might be anger, right? Resentment. This might feel unfair. I might feel angry because I'm actually having this conversation. This doesn't seem right for various reasons. Maybe I feel like I'm being, picked on, or it's unreasonable, or, etc. I'm glad you also mentioned embarrassment. I want to circle back to that. You're this adult being criticized and sort of in that in trouble mode by this other adult. And it just feels weird, right? It feels odd. It's embarrassing.
Yeah. In general, adults don't like to be corrected by other adults. And that's something that is a tough thing for us managers to balance, right? Because we know that, and we put ourselves in that position as well, hopefully, and have some empathy. And we know people don't like these conversations, yet we have to have them.
Yeah, no, that's so true. So one of the first things you mentioned there, I want to circle back to fear. I think that's a really critical thing to talk about as we're putting ourselves in the shoes of the employee. They're going to have fear, and the iterations, right, of fear can be defensiveness, anxiety, lots of other iterations. But the bottom line is fear. And so let's start with, what is it that an employee might be afraid of? And the first one you mentioned was is a status piece, right? A fear of not measuring up, a fear of not doing good enough. What else might the employee be afraid of in this conversation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, on just kind of a super practical level of what they could be afraid of. I mean, hey, they might be afraid of losing their job. Like, right. Let's start there, right? Is this a conversation where I get kicked out of this company or this organization? I'd be lying if I said I haven't gone into a conversation that I'm getting critical feedback and my mind is already going to, oh, I'm about to lose my job, aren't I?
And that's really important that we stop there for a minute, because let's remember that the employee is going to very possibly, and I think you're right, I'd say probably go to worst case scenario, and maybe not full-fledged into it, maybe not coming in convinced that they're going to be fired. But when they're dealing with a power differential situation like this, right? They're being called in, they're being criticized, they're being critiqued, right? They're in trouble, whatever you want to say. That at least some of the energy is going to go toward, oh no, what's the other shoe going to be? Am I getting demoted? Am I getting fired? Right? That's a pretty profound fear, because it gets to their livelihood, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We tend to catastrophize. I think it's a type of negativity biased in a sense. It's like, I've even been in situations where I go into to get some feedback, and it's going to be positive feedback. Mm-hmm. And I'm already thinking about, I might be losing my job. Like, we tend to go to the worst case scenario. And I think as leaders, as managers, we got to recognize that when we're in these conversations, right? Recognize that this person isn't starting from a neutral place when they're sitting down to have this conversation with you. So I think there's all, again, fear for losing your job, not getting, maybe the bonus that you're hoping for this year because you're failing, fear of losing trust with your manager, right?
Right.
Oh, this person doesn't trust me now, so therefore I need to be walking on eggshells. And yeah, I think that kind of hits at the core for me in terms of what I've experienced.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the risk of being redundant, you started again with that status thing. And I just want to go back to that one more time. That fear of I'm not doing as well as I thought I was doing. And now someone else is pointing this out and other people might know about this. That's a big deal, right? Think you're getting an A and find out you're getting a C or whatever it might be, right? That kind of cuts to the core of who we are as humans and how we sort of hold up our self-esteem. So you said something a minute ago, Ethan. It's important that we recognize these emotions, that we recognize the possible feelings that the employees are going to have. You know what? Why is it important for us as managers to be practicing the art of empathy in this situation? Meaning the kind of empathy where I'm imagining what it would be like for you in this situation. Why does that matter?
By practicing empathy, imagining what it's like to be in this person's shoes right now, and very likely you don't have to imagine, we've all been in this place before.
Right.
It allows you to show up in that conversation in the way that you would hope somebody would show up for you when they're giving you that tough conversation.
Good.
Right.
Yes.
To recognize, that all this kind of fear stuff is going on. Right. With empathy, we then recognize that this person is probably in a fight, flight, and freeze mode. And so then I can choose my language, my body language in order to try to get them out of that fight, fight, or freeze mode and into a place where they can more be open, where they can be curious about this conversation, where they can generally feel as safe as they can in this conversation. And I don't think any of that happens without remembering what it's like to be in this person's position right now.
Oh man, that was really well said. And I want to park here for a few minutes because this is really important. You think about the end result that we want, right, in this conversation. I mean, we want something restorative, right? We want trust to be built. We want eyes to be opened. We want some realizations. We want a really good back and forth listening and hearing each other and communicating. I mean, you want all this really great stuff to happen from this difficult situation. And there's no way that's going to happen if we come in with sort of an attitude of I'm here to get my needs met as a manager. I'm here to, make sure the message is delivered and make sure the employee does exactly what I want them to do. If that's the approach, we're going to miss the opportunities for connection, for helping, like you said, helping the employee work through some of that activated place that they're in so they can listen and hear and, do some action planning with you. Empathy is, I think, the most important ingredient, I think, for these conversations to go really well.
Yeah, totally agree. And just to riff on that a bit further, when we're in fear mode, when this employee in front of you is in fear mode, they are in self-protection mode, right? And this puts them in kind of the primary, when they are in self-protection mode, their primary goal in this conversation is to kind of be right. Like, I got to show that I'm not messing up here. I got to show that I'm right. Right, which is the kind of the opposite of learning and curiosity and self-reflection. When we are kind of in our sympathetic nervous system, right, the fear mechanism of our brain, we're in the position to protect our ego, right, and it shuts down our ability to self-reflect and learn, as I said. So I know I'm being somewhat repetitive here. Coming back to the empathy is what allows you to show up, act in a way that helps that person get curious about this conversation, right? And be in a mindset of learning.
Let's nerd out a little bit on that you're talking about the sympathetic nervous system kicking in and absolutely going to self-protection. And you said they want to be right. They're going to prove they're right. That's the fight response, right? So that's one of the four possibilities, that they're going to go into a pushback, defensiveness, prove they're right. And again, this is natural. This is normal. It's not because there's something wrong with them. It's because they're human and they have amygdala and they're doing the thing, right? So they're self-protective. Now they might go into more of a freeze. They might, more of a shutdown, more of a just, if I can be invisible, if I can not take up too much space here, maybe this will, just be over soon and I can escape. They might go into a flight mode of some sort of, I just have to get out of here, which could be a lot of really quick agreeing, and I don't really want to have a conversation. Let's just make this end quickly. They could go into fawn, right? We have fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is that I'm just gonna suck up and compliment you and just agree with everything you say, boss, so that I don't get hurt in this situation. But whatever it is, you're absolutely right. We go into a mode that's all about keeping myself safe. And if we're not addressing that by the way we show up, and again, the primary way we're going to do that is through empathy. We're not going to get anywhere in this conversation. In fact, we're probably going to hurt the relationship in one way or another.
I love everything you said there. And it also reminds me that if I'm the manager in this situation and I'm having to give this tough feedback, right, and I'm not that sociopath that loves giving this type of feedback in these conversations, then I'm going to be coming in with some of my own fears, right? Some of my own emotions as well. So they're feeling fear and emotion, right? And I'm also likely to come in maybe feeling some fear and emotion because I don't want to have this conversation. And so I think another important conversation to have here is, what can we do as the manager that has to have this conversation to make sure we're in the right mindset, right? To make sure we're coming to a place where we're not working from our amygdala, right? And I think part of that comes back to, practicing empathy going into that conversation. But I think there's other things that we should keep in mind about kind of the way we're going to show up in that conversation to make sure we're not in a fear mode. What has been your experience about that? I mean, do you go into fear mode when you have to have these conversations, or do you love it?
I do not love it. I'm not a sociopath. I think everyone goes into these conversations from the manager point of view with anxiety of some sort, which is just a form of fear. So yes, I do feel that. And I think you're right. We have to, while we're practicing empathy toward the employee, meaning, imagining what it's like for them, we're also practicing self-awareness. What am I experiencing as I'm getting ready for this conversation? And when I notice the anxiety, I guess your question is, what do I do with that? I think I'll start with just noticing and calling it what it is and allowing it, right? Meaning I am now feeling some anxiety. My heart's beating a little faster. I tend to feel my anxiety a little bit more in my chest. Okay, there is that thing. I know what this is. It's anxiety, it's fear. I'm going to allow this, meaning I'm not going to punish myself for feeling this or try to suppress it. I'm going to notice it and allow it. That's where I'm going to start. What about you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the starting point. That's a great starting point of just recognizing and sitting with the emotions you're feeling. And I think to do that, you need to give yourself a little bit of time before this conversation, right? I think Don't wait till you're in that conversation to start checking in with how you're feeling, right? Spend 5 minutes before that conversation just feeling what it feels like right now, right? And recognizing kind of where your mental state is at, where your bodily state is at. What has worked well for me when I'm going into these conversations or any tough conversation is I like this kind of above the line, below the line check-in. And I discovered this from the
Neuro Leadership Institute. Yep.
That's it. And it's just a check-in. It's like, okay, where am I at right now? If I am below the line, I'm in self-protection mode. I am in the mode of where my kind of primary state, my primary mental state and goal in this conversation is I need to be right in this conversation. Kind of like what I said earlier, right? Now, above the line is you're in a state of, again, curiosity, openness, with the primary goal being to learn in this conversation. And so I think just that framework is helpful when you do your self-check-in. Where am I at right now? Am I above the line or below the line? And I think once you gain that awareness for where you're at, right, it's not bad to come in, below the line. But by being aware that you're below the line, okay, now I can make sure that I'm doing other things in this conversation to make sure that I don't show up in a way of defensiveness, of needing to be right in this conversation, as opposed to learning together through this conversation. And so I think that check-in is really helpful. And then I'll just throw in one more that's been useful for me, is just a reflection, maybe call it a meditation on just some self-compassion. Again, it's hard to have these conversations. And if you're anticipating they're going to push back or kind of get mad at you or whatever it may be, that can hurt, right? It can feel like I'm messing up. And so I think reflecting on the fact that, I might not do everything perfect in this conversation, and that's okay. Nobody's perfect. Right? It helps me get into a place where I can just be there with them, as opposed to kind of focusing on protecting my self-image.
Yeah, those are great. You reminded me, the above the line, below the line, another thought if you do that self-awareness, that self-assessment, and you do discover that you're below the line, you're not in a place where you're going to be able to have a open back and forth dialogue. You're maybe feeling defensive. You might be angry. There might be other stuff going on for you. Another thing to consider is maybe postponing, right? I just want to throw the practical piece in there. It might be better to have the conversation later when you are feeling a little bit more grounded and ready to have that conversation in a way that's going to be beneficial to both parties. And then the other thing I want to add is prepare. And, you mentioned taking some time to mentally, emotionally prepare. Let's talk about practically, physically preparing by, writing out your BIRCH, birch thing that we've talked about before, right? I can't even overemphasize how important it is to go into the conversation already having a bit of a map, and not one that's going to be rigid, because that's, you don't want to go point by point by point and drive the conversation in that way. But you really want to have a lot of energy left over in that conversation to be able to connect with the employee and to express empathy and to answer their questions and to deal with whatever's going to come at you. And you're not going to have that energy available if you go into the conversation and you haven't even thought about how you're going to describe the behavior yet, or you haven't even thought about the impact of that behavior and how you want to explain that, et cetera. So you got to prepare ahead of time for the conversation so you really can be available to the employee during the conversation.
I mean, that's terrific. And I love how you're kind of talking about, if you come in without preparing, then you're kind of having to use all this cognitive energy to figure out how you're going to say this, right? And in what order, right? But if you just prepare even a little bit, okay, you've saved that cognitive energy. So now you can use that to be there emotionally with that person. And so I just like that in terms of
it's a little math problem we use in the training workshops, and it's the units of energy. You imagine that you have like 10 units of energy to spend in that conversation, and the math problem is it costs 7 units of energy to go from the behavior to the impact to the replacement behavior and have all those things figured out and know what you're going to say. That costs 7 units of energy, but it also costs 7 units of energy to stay present and deal with your own emotions and provide empathy and stay connected and all that stuff you need to do. And you can't do both, right? It adds up to 14. You don't have enough. Something's going to have to go, right? You're not going to be able to do the job as well as you want to do the job. And so what you do is you take care of the initial 7 units ahead of time, right? You deal with that so that when you show up in the meeting, you have all 10 left over to deal with all the things that come up. So
that's great.
Yeah.
I was working with a coaching client a few weeks ago. I was helping them prepare to have a pretty tough conversation with their employees. And the one thing we spent a good amount of time talking about in terms of prepping for this conversation is actually just remembering why you're doing this. That it's not about, it's obviously not about wanting to be mean to anybody, right? But just remembering that you're actually doing this to help them and to help your team. At the end of the day, it's in their best interest that you're doing this, right? And I think by reflecting on that, it helps you calm yourself down a little bit, right? You really do them a disservice by not addressing problematic behaviors, right? Behaviors that are damaging to the organization or to the team or to them. By not having these conversations, you actually put them in a position to potentially fail, right? And this is actually the opposite of care and respect, right? We often get caught up on, I don't want to have this conversation with them because it's going to be hard, it's going to be upsetting to them, and they're not going to feel cared about and respected. Well, they may not feel that right away in the moment, and you can't totally control that. But it is actually coming out of a place of care and respect, that not wanting them to fail or the team to fail. And so having that reflection, like I said, I think puts you in a good place to start that conversation.
I really like that. Going into the conversation with that up front on the front burner, right? Caring about the person, caring about the team. That's really good. So we've established, I think, through other podcasts that there's a lot of moving parts to these conversations. You want to be prepared, all those great things. Bottom line is this is difficult for you, and it's even more difficult for them. And let's remember that. Let's go in with that understanding that this is a really hard situation for them to be in. Let's be empathetic about that. And now, if I can kind of move us forward here, Ethan, let's spend some time talking about the kinds of responses that we might get back from an employee that we would like to have some tricks up our sleeves to be able to deal with. We want to be able to know how best to respond when an employee responds this way or that way. Again, what we hope for is just a sincere, hey, you're right, and I want to make some changes and maybe you can help me. And you hope for that's really nice resolve. But of course, that doesn't always happen. So let's go one at a time, talk about some of these responses, some of these behaviors. Ethan, what might be one that would be kind of the top of your list of, oh my gosh, this one would be difficult. What do you do when an employee does this?
Yeah, so you're having this tough conversation. You've delivered the feedback, hopefully using the BIR or Birch method. I mean, one, and I don't know if this is in any order of what I'd find most difficult, but just the shutting down, the freeze mode of fear that you mentioned earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Where they just kind of nod or not even that and just stare at you and just like look like they're not even paying attention. I mean, that's really difficult because at least if they're disagreeing outwardly, well, now you kind of have something to work with in a conversation. But if they totally shut down, that's tough.
Yeah, you actually started with one of the more difficult ones. So thank you for that, Ethan. Yeah, what do you do with that? First thing is you're going to ask some questions to see if they're literally at the point where they're not going to communicate. Because that's different than sort of seeming to sort of shut down during the time when you're speaking. But if they're literally not answering you back, like a complete sort of not participating, that's a little bit more of a severe response than someone who has really short answers and doesn't really participate much, but they're at least a tiny bit engaged. So ask some questions, kind of get a sense of how shut down, how frozen they really are. I'd also suggest possibly making sure that, your message was spoken and then giving them some time. You know what? We don't have to have a conversation about this right now. Why don't you just go ahead and process this, think about it. Let's revisit this again, maybe tomorrow. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed, right? They're afraid, they're processing, they really aren't ready to have a conversation. So maybe allow the grace of just some time off. What do you think about that?
I mean, I love it. And when I've had, people do that for me, I really appreciated it, right? I don't always, especially if in these difficult conversations and someone's giving me difficult feedback, I don't always process that well right in the moment. And so when I've had people say, do you want to talk about this now? Or, hey, maybe we talk about it more tomorrow or next week, give you a chance to think about it. I love that. I think that's a great option, especially for your processors on your team. They might need that more than the expedients. Not always. An expedient might still need some time, and it could be a good thing. But I think this is also another reason to have kind of awareness of the behavioral styles on your team. I'll link to the behavioral styles episodes in the show notes as well.
That's a good reminder, folks. If you know your employee's behavior style, you're going to be able to do a little bit of predicting as to what they might need more of or less of in this conversation. So, this part of the conversation reminds me, Ethan, that you don't have to win the conversation, right? This isn't a conversation to win. You don't have to get the employee to say, oh, you're right, I was wrong. Here's, you don't have to land there. If you share what you need to share and they hear you and the behavior changes, it's a win, right? So it's okay to be maybe open-handed about the kinds of responses you might get back. And if they sit there and don't want to say much at all, then that might be perfectly okay.
Right. And at the same time, I mean, that follow-up conversation is pretty critical because I think at some level they need to respond to that at some point, right? Whether they agree with it or disagree with it or somewhere in between. I mean, would you say that that's that's kind of a requirement in these type of conversations. Like at some point, you're going to need them to respond with their kind of stance on the feedback.
I try to go in these conversations without a lot of requirements. And I guess I'd say no. I would say it's a preference. Absolutely. Right. My first preference is that we have a great conversation now. Second preference would be that we have that conversation tomorrow or at our next one-on-one. But if that's not going to happen for whatever reason, either they just don't want to talk about it anymore, I'm probably not going to push on this if I'm getting what I wanted, which is change behavior, right? If they got the mess, and I've actually been in a couple of situations where this is exactly what happened. The conversation wasn't super mutual. The person got the message. They might have said something like, fine, they're not real happy. They don't want to talk anymore about it, and things get better. Now, the follow-up conversation in that case would be me offering praise, right? At a later date. Hey, thanks so much. I noticed things have gotten better in this situation, or, you've, finishing your work on time or whatever it is we were talking about. I really appreciate that. And that might be it.
No, that makes sense. I agree with that. I would say kind of maybe at the bare minimum, you at least need to make sure that they heard what you were saying, right? Which is kind of comes back to the part of giving good feedback is kind of checking in with them. I just want to make sure that I communicated what I was trying to communicate here. Did you hear what I'm saying? Them saying, yes, I hear what you're saying is obviously not the same thing as agreeing, but I would say that's the bare minimum of what you're trying to get out of this.
Yeah, let's do another one. What do you think an employee needs from you as the manager when they start crying? What would be pretty appropriate manager response in that situation?
Well, this one is difficult for me. I don't respond great to that. Like I don't necessarily know what to do.
Right.
What have you done?
Well, first of all, I feel super awkward and uncomfortable. Like you, it's hard for me in that setting. I guess I think they need three things. They need a tissue. I think you're right on that one. I think they might need time. I think that's another opportunity just to give the person a break or a few minutes, or you want to circle back in half an hour, or, just at least offer. And then I guess just some compassion, some empathy, some, remembering that they're feeling some strong feelings, right? There's stuff going on for them. And this is a chance to plug in to that and to maybe ask a question, to express some empathy, connect. I think that's what they really need at this moment.
I love it. I mean, I don't love that they're crying, but I love the response. So here's another response, if you're okay with me moving on.
Yes, let's do.
This can actually be a somewhat difficult one, but what about them just generally disagreeing with your feedback, but disagreeing with grace, right? Like disagreeing well, like they're doing that good receiving feedback non-defensively thing where they say, I totally hear what you're saying. If I'm hearing you right, this is what you're saying. I see things a little bit differently. Here is how I see it. And kind of the general message there being, I actually don't think I did this wrong, or I'm in the wrong here. That's a response, and that's a great response at some level if you get that. But what do you do in case if they're disagreeing with you, right? And you're still needing them to change the behavior, but they're disagreeing.
I'm really glad you brought that one up, and I'm going to agree with you. First of all, I like that. I like that second best to them just agreeing with me, right? That's what I really like. But, they're going to be in the conversation in a really appropriate, connected way, but they see it differently. I love that. And I first of all, of course, it's a great opportunity just to discuss the thing, right? Let's look at the expectations. Let's look at your performance. Let's compare. Let's see if we can come to some agreement. Let's talk about what I'm missing, and it's possible. Let's keep in mind, the employee might be absolutely right. Let's be open to the fact that we might have misread the situation, if that's, if that's appropriate or possible in this case.
Yes.
Let's make sure that we're open to the fact that we might have missed some extenuating circumstances, or we didn't communicate very well. If we can come in with some humility and some openness, we're going to get a lot of relational points in that employee-employer relationship if we're able to dialogue on that level. But what if you're right? This is the art of remembering that you don't have to win the conversation. I don't necessarily need the person to walk away agreeing with me, believe it or not. what do I need, right? What's my bottom line? It's change behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen lots of situations where the employee was saving face by not agreeing or not giving in because they really didn't want to give in. But as long as I can leave that conversation assured that I have been clear about the expectations going forward. And so it might sound like something like this. It might sound like, look, we're not seeing it the same way, or you're saying that you are not behaving this way in meetings. All right, here's bottom line. I just need to make sure that you are doing X, Y, and Z, right? And not these other things. Well, that's what I'm doing. Person might say, I'm doing it right. Okay, good. We're on the same page. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So, the person leaves the conversation. They didn't agree with you that it was a problem, but they have heard your expectation. And hopefully you'll see the end result of that.
And just to highlight that thing you've said a couple times now, the goal here is behavior change. And there are situations, as we very well know, in which someone might disagree with your feedback. Maybe they're saying something like, no, I was doing that behavior, but I don't agree that it's an issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's an issue. Well, okay. This is where it gets a little tricky, because that's when you might have to say, if you know that this is kind of non-negotiable, like even if they disagree that this behavior is an issue, you still need them to stop doing it, and you've landed there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we may have to agree to disagree that this is an issue, but I still need you to change that, regardless of if you agree it's an issue or not. And of course, you have a dialogue with them about why they might not think it's an issue, but it's okay to walk away disagreeing as long as the message is clear that you still need things to change.
What about responses that are kind of passive aggressive, eye rolling, and other negative body language? They're shaking their head, they're sighing. These sort of subtle, usually kind of physical body language related responses. How might you respond, or would you respond?
What I've learned is best in this situation for me is you can just generally try to ignore that stuff. They're doing it. You can't control that they're doing it. And so to maybe just kind of brush it off and just kind of keep plowing ahead in the conversation, that would be one option. I think the other option maybe is to, if it's like loud and right there and it's distracting the conversation, to check in on it. What are you thinking? How are you feeling about this? Right? Try to get that subtle passive aggressive behavior out into some words, right? That you can kind of work with and have a conversation around. So what would you do?
Those are great. I'm trying not to be redundant and repeat what you say, but going back to just letting it be, right? There's a time and a place just to ignore it. And what helps me with that is to remind myself what they're probably feeling, right? They're sad. We didn't mention that one earlier, by the way. They're fearful, they're angry, they're defensive, whatever it is they're feeling, just give them that outlet, right? They're rolling their eyes or they're sighing a little bit. So I want to start with that. Yeah, it's okay to let things be and let your empathy kind of give you permission to let that go. I love your second thing, right? Just asking them what's happening, right? What's going on for you? What are you feeling? That's a really, really good approach. And I would just add maybe to let them know that whatever it is that they are feeling, that it's okay to talk about that, right? It's okay to speak freely. It's okay to be open. I know this isn't easy to be sitting here having this conversation with me, so maybe some kind of assurance that there's some safety here, that it's okay for them to tell you really what they're thinking and what they're feeling, because they might be holding on to, disagreeing with you, or they think it's unfair. They might be having some pretty profound reactions inside, but they're too afraid to say it. So it's leaking out, in physical behaviors. So just give them permission.
Yeah. And by the way, there's, of course, a big difference between inquiring, kind of asking how they're feeling, how they're processing this, than making kind of assumptions about what they're feeling, right? I think that's what you're trying to avoid here, right? To say, I know you're really mad about this because they're rolling their eyes and shaking their head. Well, guess what? As we've talked about in other episodes, that just makes them more defensive because you're not supposed to be able to read people's minds, right? And so you're trying to mind read, they get on the defense. So rather than, I know you're feeling angry about this, or I know you're upset about this, to, how are you feeling about this?
Right.
What are you thinking?
Yes.
Right?
That's really
I
good.
just wanted to make that difference there, because I think sometimes people get caught up with that.
Yeah, and that's really good. Nobody wants to be told what they're feeling, even if you're right. So that's really good. There's a broad category that we spend a fair amount of time addressing this in the workshops around just kind of the basic argumentativeness, right? The person comes back and they're just going to argue the point. What do you do in a situation when you're just getting a lot of pushback? Just a couple quick principles on that. I will never forget the manager who came to me and said, so this employee argued with me for 45 minutes yesterday. And as he's telling me the story, I said to him, so when you guys were having that argument yesterday, and he cut me off and he said, no, wait, I was not arguing. He argued with me for 45 minutes. And I told him, I'm having a hard time picturing this conversation. Are you saying that you were quiet for 45 minutes while he just kept saying things to you? And the guy goes, no. I kept pointing out where he was wrong. And I said, okay, so how is that not two people having an argument? He goes, well, because I'm the boss and I was right. Therefore, he wasn't arguing.
Right.
The employee was arguing, right? And
you're not arguing if you're right.
Exactly. Yeah. You're just pointing out the truth, right? And so one of the two principles before we get into arguing or dealing with arguments is just to remember it really does take two people to have an argument, meaning you as a manager don't have to have an argument. I want to just remind our listeners, you actually have control of your end of the equation, which means you literally don't have to have an argument if you use some of these techniques that we'll talk about. So, and then one more thing real quickly, I don't want to monologue here, but the other principle to remember is that the goal of an argument is to win, right? That's really what both people are trying to do. If you stop and ask yourself what you're trying to accomplish in an argument, you are actually trying to win. You're trying to get the other person to see it your way. And remembering that will help managers remember, again, that you actually have other ways of winning, if you want to put quotes around the word winning, right? Winning does not always require the other person to say exactly what you wanted them to say.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. A couple things there. It takes two to tango, right? If you're arguing, that means you're a part of it. Redefining what it means to quote unquote win, right? Again, if someone's arguing with you, I think, one thing to remember at front and center is to get out of that argument, you can just do things like inquiry, right? Ask questions about what they're pushing back on, listen, paraphrase what they're saying, continue to show empathy, right? If someone's just arguing with you and you're get curious about that and you start paraphrasing that, it can de-escalate that a bit. They're like, oh, this person's not here to argue with me. Okay, they're listening and they care. Right, that can kind of halt the arguing right there. Sometimes, not all the time.
No, that's actually really important. We've got like these 9 different methods to deal with arguing, and the reason the one you just mentioned is because I think I don't have stats for this, but I think most of the time that approach right there takes care of the arguing. Meaning when you're willing to just be in a conversation with them and, let's say that I'm correcting you, Ethan, and you start pushing back and arguing. And instead of pushing back against your pushback, I ask you about your pushback. I say, tell me more, or I paraphrase what you just said. And I ask for more clarification. And I just, and I show some empathy, right? I mean, all of a sudden you're being heard. So you don't actually have to bring all that arguing energy to the situation.
Yeah. And, I hate to bang this drum too many times here, but it is coming back to, how powerful curiosity is. When someone else in a conversation sees you getting curious, they start getting curious as well. Now, outside of that, you're asking, you're listening, you're paraphrasing, you're showing empathy while they're arguing with you. Maybe that's not working. What else? What else can you do there?
Well, I think another thing which is a little bit more kind of woven through the conversation and maybe a little bit more proactive is that you really be very aware of your the energy that you're putting out in terms of energy that could escalate versus energy that could de-escalate. For example, your tone, your volume. I was doing work with a 911 call center, and we got to watch these great videos of first responders showing up. And you could see the difference between first responders who escalated the situation versus the ones who de-escalated. And the ones who escalated, they would take whatever volume the person they were there to work with, whatever volume they were coming in with, the loudness or the anger or whatever, the first responder would sort of match that volume and that sort of aggressive body language stance. that they were seeing there, which caused the other person to just escalate further, because the goal of an argument is to win, right? And that was versus these other first responders who would come in and they would talk quieter than the other person was talking, and they would have more relaxed body language, and that they would use a different tone. And that tended to bring the energy level down. And so just being aware of our ability to escalate or de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, I love that. And there's actually some good research to support as your tone comes down and gets softer and it de-escalates that whole conversation. I remember I took this kind of mini masterclass course on negotiation, and it was with a former FBI negotiator. And I kind of liked what he was saying. He was talking about kind of going into your FM radio host voice.
I love that. NPR.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Welcome to the show.
We've got some cool jazz to play.
We've got some cool jazz for you tonight. Just hang in there, folks. Now I'm exaggerating that, but that general vibe right there of kind of you slow down, right? You kind of have a soft voice. That can actually help. That can help. So anyways, just wanted to throw in that little fun thing that I had learned there.
I love it. Yeah. All right. Now some more techniques here. You got arguing coming at you. Take a side trip, which means, they are concerned because they think you're not being fair because so-and-so else, this other person gets away with it, or, whatever it might be. Go where they want to go. Don't push back with, well, we're not here to talk about that person. We're talking about, no, ask questions, go in the direction they want to go in. They want to talk about something that seems a little bit not related, but it's concerning them. Go where they want to go. This is not a recipe, right? These are lots of different choices, and you probably don't want to take 17 side trips, but giving them some permission to have some control of that conversation, as opposed to you being the only person in control, can get you a lot of grace back from that employee.
Mm-hmm. Good. Now, another principle here, or tactic here, whatever you want to call it, for avoiding getting into an argument, you use this term kind of argument busters.
Right.
Talk to me more about that. What do you mean by argument busters? What does that look like, sound like in general?
This would be the alternative approach to what I just mentioned. This is, let's say you've already done a couple of those side trips and you really don't want to do a bunch more of those. You actually now need them to kind of stay where you are on the map. So this would be the time to say something like, hey, I understand that you feel that way. Here's what I need you to do. Or I can see why that might be difficult. Here's what I would like you to change. It's basically acknowledging their attempt to do something else or go somewhere else, and acknowledging it with some kind of, with some kindness, but then getting right back to where you were going before. And so it's just that may be, or however, and getting back to where you need to be. So it's a very simple technique, but it's something that we also use when we were doing parenting workshops back in the day, right? Instead of going down every side trip and, you say, hey, it's time for you to go to bed. And the kid says, well, John's mom isn't making him go to bed early. You say something like, well, that's probably true. And I need you to go get ready for bed.
Okay, that makes sense. Anything more you want to say about argument busters?
No, but actually let's put these three things together. We've got one more that kind of relates to their attempt to go sideways. We said take a side trip, which was one option. You've got the argument buster, which is another option. And then there's this next one, which is go ahead and bookmark the thing they want to talk about. Just don't talk about it now. So, hey, they bring up some policy that you don't think is super relevant to the situation, but they want to talk about this policy. You might want to say, hey, you know what? That sounds like something we really want to get into. Let's go ahead and finish this part of the conversation first, and then we'll circle back to that.
This is kind of the counter or the opposite to taking a side trip, right? You could take a side trip and go there with them for a bit, or you bookmark it and say, we'll come back to that. Am I interpreting that correctly there? There's kind of two options here, depending on the situation.
Yeah, well, there's actually three. So I think you're right. So take a side trip is one. Argument buster just says, no, we're actually going where I want to go, right? Mm-hmm. And then this third option is, no, we will go where you want to go, just not now. So at our next one-on-one, let's talk about that. Here, I'm writing it down, see, but yeah, some version of I promise we're going to go there, but not yet. Gotcha.
Okay. So again, we kind of have your options here: ask, listen, paraphrase, shows empathy. You got de-escalate, you got take a side trip, You got use argument busters. You got bookmark the conversations. You also have create conversation expectations. Now, let me ask you, is that something that you're doing prior to the conversation? Like, hey, let's set some expectations about how we're going to have this conversation here. Or is that something you do once they kind of start going into argument mode?
The latter. Yeah. This is that moment where you say to yourself, it's time to have a bit of a macro conversation here. We need to talk for a minute or two, or even a few seconds, about how we're talking to each other right now. So this is the time where you might want to stop and say, hey, you know what? I really need us both to take turns talking and listening to each other and not interrupting. Can we do that? Or the moment where you say, hey, I really need us to stay on this track for the next few minutes and talk about this, and then we'll have some other conversations. But could you stay with me for a little while on this? Or you might even need to ask the person to lower their voice, possibly, because they're starting to yell. It's just, I've been in situations where I wished the manager would have actually stopped and talked about how they're talking to each other, as opposed to letting the unhealthiness just kind of be there and you're both sort of marinating in it.
Yeah. And the reason why I love that one, it comes back to the awareness piece, right? When we are in fight, flight, freeze mode, and since we're talking about arguments, we're probably in the fight mode here, but we're not always aware, right? We're kind of working on autopilot, right? So we might be arguing, we might be interrupting, just to be able to kind of stop that and say, hey, let's regroup here on how to make sure we can continue to have a healthy conversation here. That right there can help a person realize, oh, I was doing that thing. I love that, just kind of pointing to some self-awareness, helping them be self-aware in that conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The next one, we already talked about here in this hour, but it's just, it might be time to give in because you were wrong. Be persuaded, right? Might be time to say, all right. And it might not be black and white, like I was totally wrong, you were totally right. But there might be some place in that conversation for you to say, you know what, I absolutely could have communicated that better, and I'm going to own that. Or time you might say, you know what, now that you've explained the whole story, I'm seeing it a little bit differently. Thanks for filling in the gaps for me.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the principles of just having healthy conversations in general, if you can find something that you agree with, even if you disagree with 99%, but you find the one thing that you could, agree with or change your viewpoint on, it's a really great place to start, right? That's how you kind of keep that conversation going to get to some sort of resolution. Start with what you can agree with. And of course, that, like you said, starts with you being open that you might not be totally right here, that you could be persuaded. Yeah. Now, another piece here is maybe just remembering that I am this person's manager. Right. I am in charge here. Now, how do you use that one in a way that doesn't, exaggerate your power differential here, but using kind of that power differential in a healthy way, so you can make sure this conversation reaches, the goal that you're aiming for?
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad that you brought up the power differential, because remind our listeners that the power differential is a thing. It's there, it's real, and it's not bad. We're not going to get back into this, but in most cases, we're trying to mitigate it somewhat so that we're safe and that we're not overpowering and that they're psychologically safe. But there's also obviously a time and a place to use your power differential. And the fact that you're actually having this conversation is using your power differential, right? You do have the responsibility to correct behavior. So you're using your power differential. Well, here's a place where in the conversation itself, you might need to lean a little bit more into your power differential and just make a call, right? Hey, I know I can see that we're disagreeing. This is the way I need it done. It's basically using the manager card, right? The authority card, and saying, we don't have to agree. I think you said this really well, actually, a little while ago, Ethan. We don't have to agree on this. However, this is what I need to see going forward. So that's what we mean by just remember that you're in charge. And sometimes you just have to stop at that and land there.
Beautiful. And notice what we're not saying here. We're not saying, well, I'm the manager, so that's why, right? You're not throwing out the fact that you have power over them, not explicitly in a sense. At least I would personally avoid that in these conversations.
No, I'm actually really glad you said that, because I think that could be misunderstood. Yeah, I totally agree that when it's time for you to say, Here's how we're going to do it. I see that we disagree. This is what I need from you going forward. Those are the kinds of words you're using. What you're not saying is, you're not having to prove anything. And I love that you said, I love the way you said that. You don't have to talk about you being the boss. You don't have to, make your power differential sound big and scary and powerful. You just have to claim it. You just have to gently claim your authority by saying, this is what I need.
Now, winding down here, there's another option here for avoiding arguments, which is exit. Now, what do we mean by that, Mr. Nash?
This isn't a thing that comes up quite often, but it's come up. I've seen some situations where the conversation kept going and it turned more and more argumentative because the person who's sort of leading the dance, in this case, the manager, didn't stop the dance. They just kept going and going and going. And it's almost like they didn't know that they could actually, start to gather their stuff and they can start to stand up and they can say, hey, you know what, I think we're done. Let's go ahead and regroup at our one-on-one and talk about, just end the thing. And I know that seems kind of obvious, but I've seen that missed a few times. And so I want to remind our managers out there that, it's okay to be done and then physically show that you're done by getting up and getting ready to leave. Sometimes that's what's needed to kind of break the spell and move on to the next part of your day and kind of give the employee permission as well to be done.
Well, there you have it. There you have it. Those are our 9 options for you. And you may use multiple of them in one conversation. There's a potential for that. Now, I'm curious what you might do as a manager in another scenario here, right? So you're having this hard conversation with your employee. Maybe they're arguing or doing other things, and then they kind of throw out some sort of threat, right? Well, you know what? I'm going to go talk to your boss about this, right? Or something along those lines, right? I'm going to go up to the CEO and talk to them. I'm going to go to HR. What do you do in that situation? Because one, that kind of, for most people, that'll put you back on your heels into even more of a fear mode. If They're saying, I'm going to go talk to your boss about it, or HR, and now you're questioning yourself. Did I mess up here? Did I say something wrong? How do you respond to that?
The sarcastic part of me, and listeners don't do this, but I almost want to say, oh, you know what? Here's their phone number, or here, let me give you the email, or here, let me walk you over there. Perfect world, and I'm going to describe perfect world here. Perfect world, there's alignment, there's trust between you and your boss, there's trust between managers and HR. HR knows how to do the sort of the air traffic controlling piece of, dealing with those kinds of things that come to them. They know how to support their managers. All this stuff is in place. That's perfect world, so that you can have confidence to be able to say to the employee, that's absolutely their right to go have those conversations. You could even encourage it. That's my favorite response, just to get out of their way. Don't put up resistance to it. Check that part of you that is now feeling fear and don't show that to the employee, but instead let them know that there's really no secrets here and it's totally okay for them to have those conversations. I think that kind of, in a good way, kind of takes the wind out of the sails sometimes. Now, if you don't have that confidence and there's concern that it's going to go sideways, I think I would still respond that way. And then I would probably make a beeline to whoever that person is and just make sure that we are communicating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Get ahead of it. Let them know it's coming. Explain the situation in a sense. Yeah. No. And I think that, another reason why it's absolutely critical that everybody on a leadership community, on a leadership team, is aligned, right, with how to handle these type of difficult responses, how to handle situations when somebody is kind of skipping a level to give some feedback. So winding down here, we started the conversation just, reminding you why it's important that you're having these critical conversations or crucial conversations with employees, that, what you allow, you teach. By not having these, it could have effect on morale, or maybe you'll be setting that person up to fail. Right. And then, we also talked about what your employee might be feeling during these conversations. Right. And fear was kind of the big takeaway there, and all the different flavors of that. And that, of course, leads to what they might need from this conversation from you. right? Primarily being empathy. And then we got into just talking about the different type of responses you may get from employees when you're having these hard conversations, everywhere from, well, maybe agreeing, best case scenario, to disagreeing, to shutting down, to arguing, to passive aggression, to crying, to them giving you the birdie. Then we got into, these kind of 9 ways of dealing with arguments. Hopefully you're walking away with some tools in terms of how can you better have these conversations when employees don't always respond in the ideal way that you would like them to respond. Right. So besides that, anything else that you want to say here?
No, I say no, and then I always say something. Just to go right back to the beginning and kind of close with the focus on empathy. Just again, can I just say these are really hard, scary, difficult situations for the employee, especially. And so just go in aware of that. I think that's probably one of your most important, one of the most important concepts from today is just remembering what they're dealing with and keep that at the forefront of your mind as you're having these conversations.
Good stuff, folks. It's now time for the listener question of the day. Several of my employees tend to go to my boss when they don't agree with something I've decided or want something I'm not able or willing to give them. And she quite often takes their side and then asks me to change my decision. This hurts my credibility with my group, and it makes me second guess everything I do and say. How do I change this pattern?
Like so many of these questions we get and are going to get, there's, whole podcasts worth of information we could share, right? Because what we're talking about here is that whole lines of communication piece. And, in a perfect world, the manager's manager would always practice what we call the half open door policy, right? They would not have a full open door policy for every single person in the organization, because the idea is if I don't differentiate between the conversations I should be having and the ones I shouldn't, I'm at risk of really kicking the legs out from the managers who work for me. And so I need to have what's called a half open door policy for the person who reports to me for their direct reports. And so perfect world, when this manager's people skip level and come up to me and want me to second guess something that the manager did or wants me to change a decision he made, I need to engage in a certain, a set of practices, which includes asking a couple questions to get my head around it and then directing them back to where they need to go. Lots of things, right? So what do you do? And here's the question, right? What do I do when my manager's not practicing the half open door policy? What do I do about that? I feel like I always answer these questions with the same answer, which is have, yes, a difficult but important conversation with your manager. Perfect world, they're going to be open to this. They're going to hear you out. They're going to understand, but at least attempt, right? At least attempt to sit down with your manager and talk about, again, BIR, right? Here's the behavior. Here's the thing that's happening. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's the impact. Right? Here's how it impacts my ability to manage my people. And then R stands for replacement behaviors. Could we agree together that when my people come to you for these things, that you will, whatever, direct them back to me, whatever you think the right answer is. But I think going to your manager and trying to work out an agreement together has got to be your first option.
I think that's a great response. I mean, that's what I would do. As you're probably getting from this, I mean, there's no silver bullet here for fixing a situation like this, because you don't know how the other person is going to respond, right? You don't know how your boss is going to respond. So, although you mentioned, this is kind of the advice you give for other questions, is go have a conversation with that person and really, I think, hone in on the impact it's having on you. That's the place to start, right? And, sorry if you sound like a one-trick pony, but I think that is the advice here. Anyways, I don't have anything more to add than that. Folks, if you have questions you would like us to take a stab at, you can send us an email at contact@nashconsulting.com with your question or with suggestions for topics we should cover on this podcast. We'd love to hear from our listeners, and we want to make this show valuable for you. Besides that, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, night, evening, morning, whatever, and tune in again next time.